thank you very much for attending this View from the Bridge. It's been a tumultuous few days. Obviously, the British people, or at least 52% of 36% of the electorate, voted for to leave the EU, and Roy Hodgson duly delivered in a way that the other politicians haven't. I think there are a lot of questions about how this is going to pan out, and hopefully our eminent speakers have some answers. So we have three views from various different areas. We've got George Buckley, Chief UK Economist of Deutsche, who will explain to us what's going to happen to the economy, or give his best attempt. We've got David Wighton, city editor of the Wall Street Journal, who will be able to explain passporting in under a sentence without using a subclause. And Isabel Hardman from the Spectator, who is trying to work out when she's going to get some sleep, because every time she tries to go to sleep, another member of the shadow cabinet resigns. But without further ado, let me pass over to George, who's going to give us an assessment of what's happening.
Great. Well, thank you very much. When I saw the title of this, A View from the Bridge, I wasn't sure whether that was a captain of a ship or actually looking down from a bridge. It's a long way to fall. I think it probably is the latter. I'm very bearish about what happens to the economy if we do go through with this and Article 50 is triggered and we do leave the European Union. Of course, there are questions over whether that will happen, but I think on balance it probably will. And we've revised our forecast. We published an article at 10:01, well, maybe it's slightly after 10:01 on Thursday the 23rd, immediately as the polls closed. And what it did was a pre-written piece which looked at what would happen if we stayed in, what would happen if we were to leave. And on the leave side, we said that we would be reducing our forecast for GDP by more than a percentage point relative to what we thought would happen in the first place. We haven't got a recession, but we still think that GDP is going to be substantially weaker in 2017 than it would have otherwise been. We've reduced our forecast from over 2% to under 1%. The main reason for that is because of investment. Everybody I speak to is telling me that people are not investing now. It's not just a case of like before the referendum where firms were delaying investment until afterwards. If you look at the CBI survey from April, they told us that investment intentions had never been as high for the past 20 years, presumably on the assumption that firms thought we were going to stay in and there was a big wall of cash being delayed before being deployed in the second half of the year. Well, that's not going to happen, and I imagine a lot of investment funds will now not be delayed but will be diverted elsewhere. You can wait 4 months over a referendum campaign. You can't wait for 3 years until you know whether you're going to be still in the single market or not. Consumer spending is likely to be weaker. Consumer spending is worth 2/3 of the economy. The reason it's likely to be weaker is because earnings are probably going to fall because unemployment will rise if economic growth does soften. And also, people tend to save more when they're worried about their jobs. If they save more, then they can consume less out of current income. Government spending is probably one of the only or few things within the national accounts which might be actually positive, because we will no longer potentially have a chancellor who is quite so hell-bent on austerity and more likely to loosen fiscal policy, especially if in the eye of the storm when we see economic growth weaken. The weird thing is it might actually produce, on the final part of the equation in the national accounts, it might actually produce an improvement in the current account. And the reason being is because imports will be highly sensitive to lower investment and lower consumption. That will suck less imports in, but exports probably won't change a great deal because we are still a member of the EU over the next 2 years. So you might actually see an improvement in the UK's current account, which would be, but obviously for bad reasons. The question then is, what does the Bank of England do to respond? Well, the next meeting they have is in just over a couple of weeks' time, on the 14th of July. I imagine then they will do absolutely nothing. You'll see the minutes, they will tell us that they are waiting to see what the data reveals, because in the middle of July we will have no data at all, apart from the financial market moves we've seen, no data which is going to say this is what EU exit, or the potential for EU exit, has been doing to the economy. There'll be nothing at all. But at the end of July we will start to receive information, and crucially at the start of August the Bank of England's policy meeting is associated with its change of forecast. It's the August inflation report. And what they will do is they'll change their forecast for growth, for inflation, for unemployment. The problems the bank has is that it faces two opposing moves in inflation. One is that inflation is likely to spike because in the near term, because we have had a very sizable fall in the currency. It's fallen 20 big figures against the dollar. That will push inflation up. Imported goods prices will rise and it will add to CPI. Do they respond to that, or do they respond to the fact that economic growth is much weaker or likely to be much weaker and push downwards on inflation in the medium term? I suspect they will do the latter. I can't imagine the Bank of England is going to raise interest rates at this juncture to address an inflation problem which is going to be very short-lived, rather than the longer-lived inflation problem which is generated by weaker economic growth. So what do they do in August? Well, there isn't really much room in terms of policy when it comes to interest rates. I suspect that they will lower interest rates by a quarter point, not very much, be very tentative to start with, to take interest rates down to 0.25%. Do nothing more at that juncture. And then when we get into September, October time, they'll probably find that the data is weakening much more aggressively than we had expected. Investment, consumer spending, notably weaker, confidence down, and I imagine they will respond to that by not only lowering interest rates to the lowest that they are willing to do so, which I imagine might be 10 basis points. So they might take 10 or 15 basis points off that 0.25. I don't think they want to go negative at this stage. But then they might find that that's not enough and they need to start the quantitative easing programme. And that may well help support asset prices and also support economic growth during what will be, I'm sure, a very difficult time for the UK economy. So lower growth, higher unemployment, a spike in inflation followed by a fall in inflation, a political crisis and further falls in asset prices, particularly sterling, I imagine, probably hasn't reached its final settling point.
Well, that's positive, isn't it? Just one question before we all go out and hang ourselves. So the government could go down, the Bank of England could go down to 10 basis points or 0.1%. The experience of places like Japan, which have had zero or negative interest rates, is that at all encouraging? It doesn't necessarily seem that any of those have particularly worked.
They might not have worked, but presumably cutting interest rates is better than holding them at higher levels because, of course, it will mean that you can borrow for less. Now, the only argument against that is something which our chief economist at Deutsche Bank has argued, which is by holding rates so low, particularly in the ECB, for example, where rates are currently negative, minus 0.4%, it could encourage people to think that things are a lot worse than they actually are. So it might actually encourage people to save more than they would have otherwise done. So there is an argument out there which says that possibly lower interest rates might not be doing what we want them to do. And the other point is that when you lower interest rates too far, for example into negative territory, banks cannot follow that by lowering their deposit rate into negative territory. People won't have it. They won't put their money in a bank when they could put it under their mattress if you're charging people 0.5%. So there is a problem with margins. And how do banks recoup margins? Well, they might actually raise their lending rates. So lower official interest rates might do precisely the opposite to what we were expecting, which is to increase borrowing rates where we want to lower them.
I'm very encouraged by your comments. David, do you have anything more positive to say about the prospects for the city or business or anything?
Well, I think long term it's possible to paint a not so gloomy scenario. But I just start by going back to 2 weeks ago when I went to the Mansion House dinner, and I talked to several senior city figures who said, "Don't worry, David. Sorry." Don't worry, David, it'll never happen. Common sense will prevail. The degree of complacency was quite remarkable given the very high stakes involved. And the reaction has been commensurately extreme. I mean, in the city, people are now totally shell-shocked and very angry with everybody, except themselves, obviously. The government and the British people for doing something so irrational. And there is an assumption that the next few months, years will be extremely difficult for the city. but much greater disagreement about the long-term prospects. And of course, as Jason says, the biggest worry for certainly the big institutions is the extent to which UK-based financial services firms will retain their access rights through the passporting scheme. Now, some senior city figures resigned to the UK losing passport rights, and that we will inevitably expect to see a shift in jobs from London and the rest of the UK into the continued European Union to service local clients. Now, others put hope in the new MiFID regulations that come in 2018 that would extend passporting rights to non-EU firms in non-EU countries in some product areas, as long as their regulatory system remains equivalent to that in the EU. But even if passporting is eventually retained in whole or in part, it seems inevitable that jobs will be lost in the city, partly because it takes so long to shift operations into another country. Some of the big American banks say it takes between 18 months and 2 years to shift a significant operation. So if they are going to be ready to service clients under a new regime, they have to start moving before they have a very good idea at all what that new regime is going to be. So we can expect to see jobs move, and once they move, they're unlikely to come back. Now, people who've been involved in the big, particularly the Wall Street banks' contingency plans, say that their experience of looking at other centres in Europe has reinforced the attractions of London in their mind, and they're all say they're determined to keep as many people as possible in London. But the worry is that they could find that actually once they're there, EU centres turn out to be rather more competitive than they thought. And I don't think we should underestimate the extent to the anger in particularly the foreign bank, the American banks, about what has happened. They've made this huge commitment to London and massive investment on the basis of political stability and regulatory stability, and they feel they've been let down. And political stability and predictability is one of London's great strengths, and that's going to take years to rebuild. London has a lot of advantages, one of which is that there is no one single rival in Europe, and they will all be competing against each other. And some Brexiteers say, look, their headcount in the city is going to go down anyway, some of which will probably be blamed on Brexit when it wasn't. So how much does this matter? But the jobs that are likely to move will be high-value jobs that will be front office jobs rather than back and middle office jobs, which are disproportionately important in tax revenue terms and so on. But it must be said there are people in some of the big banks who think the predictions of the job losses, particularly talked about by the Wall Street banks, are exaggerated. They point to the current experience of operating from London into Asian markets, for example, where they don't have passporting rights, and they have to have operations of substance in those countries, as they will do if and when passporting goes in the EU. And actually, a large proportion of the work continues to be done in London, but much depends on the attitude of local regulators, and of course it's very difficult to say how that would what that attitude would be in the EU after passporting. Another big worry is how attractive London will remain to being for new investment from international financial institutions. There's a lot of talk about whether London will be able to consolidate its position as the hub of choice for the Chinese, international hub of choice for the Chinese banks. So what about the potential benefits to the city? The ability to cut back potentially on damaging EU regulation, and the prospects of better access to non-EU markets. So the working assumption is that an eventual deal with the EU will retain passporting rights, but with no ability to diverge from EU regulations, or the opposite, but we can't have both. And the Brexiteers who look forward to an easier regulatory regime say that the loss of a few jobs from the big investment banks would be a price worth paying, and that the city has been strangled by EU regulation for years. Though when you ask them about regulations that you realistically think that a UK government and regulatory regime could lift, the list becomes rather less impressive. As for the UK's ability to strike trade deals with non-EU countries, it's true that these would be easier for Britain to focus on those areas which are important to us, like financial services. But the process is so long drawn out that you have to discount those benefits hugely. And meanwhile, the losses from reduced access to the EU are going to be here and now very soon. In fact, the optimists say that the city will adapt, and freed from the dead hand of Brussels, it will rediscover the innovation it's shown in the past. Just think, they say, the way the massive Eurobond market was developed in London in the 1960s, grabbing the opportunity to build a dollar market that the US government had pushed offshore with ill-judged new tax regulations. That's what we could see here again, they say. But of course you could look at that example from the other side, and then what you see is a country, the US, in a careless act of self-harm, allowing a big chunk of valuable financial services businesses to be sucked overseas, never to return. And that, for the moment at least, is how most people in the city see last Thursday's vote.
More positivity. David, you quite rightly pointed out to the fact that foreign banks like political stability in the UK. Now, Isabel, there isn't a lot of political stability in the UK. I'm intrigued by the prospect of Boris standing versus Eagle as a two leaders, one haircut. The political situation is so unclear that it makes what the previous two speakers say seem certain. Can you give us an idea of what's going to happen?
What's going on? Well, thank you. And while I'm going to be honest that as a journalist I find it very satisfying to have quite so many stories coming out of the snakes and ladders game that politics is at the moment, I have to admit that I also find some aspects of it intensely dispiriting, particularly what is happening to the Labour Party, which used to be a once great party and is now in an abject mess and not providing the opposition that it's supposed to be at the moment. So I can't promise that I'm going to be any more cheerful than our other speakers. The biggest snake in this snake and ladders game has obviously been for the Conservatives, who just a year ago was celebrating winning a surprise majority. David Cameron was starting to think about his legacy project. He said in an interview with one of my lobby colleagues that he thought his legacy would be settling the Scottish independence question, rescuing the economy and settling the Europe question, which is cheerful for him. I think David Cameron is often written up as an essay crisis prime minister, and I think really the referendum has been his sort of dissertation crisis, in that many students get through the whole of university by managing actually to do those all-night essay crises and actually getting quite decent marks, but you can't do that with a dissertation, and you couldn't do it, as we've seen, with the European referendum. He was very half-hearted in his renegotiation with EU leaders. He'd known for a number of years that he was going to have a referendum, but the briefings that I was getting for months and months and months last year were that, we're going to really ramp things up in November. And then when we got to November, nothing really happened. Cameron just went to Brussels a little bit more. And what he emerged from Brussels with was a really unimpressive deal. And that is one of the great mistakes of the Remain campaign, was that it promised a renegotiation and then Cameron returned with very little, which he then could not sell as part of his campaign to keep Britain in the European Union. Every couple of weeks during the referendum campaign, he and George Osborne would suddenly remember they'd had a renegotiation and would talk about Britain in a reformed Europe, and then they'd stop talking about it again whenever they got heat from voters about what actually that reform meant. They'd also been very confident and complacent, like students with essay crises at the start of this year, that their Project Fear approach would work in this campaign. They thought that actually the Project Fear argument would be about security, about warning that Vladimir Putin would want us to leave the EU, but that had very little purchase on voters at all. So they then moved on to the economy, to frighten people with figures, made up figures, such as the warning that every household would be £4,300 worse off as a result of Brexit. And these warnings just ramped up. It was almost, if we'd had another week of the campaign, I think we would have been warned that there would be a black hole that would swallow up the whole of the world. We had Donald Tusk warning about the end of Western civilization, although I have to say, reporting from the House of Commons, it does feel like that warning's coming true at the moment. But Cameron's great failing in his renegotiation was to fail to secure anything on immigration. He came back with curbs on migrant benefits that anyone who sat for more than 5 seconds would realise actually were not going to make any difference at all, particularly given Cameron's own government was introducing a living wage. And voters saw straight through it. So the campaign really patronised voters at a time when they already hold politicians in very low esteem indeed. And we saw last night in Brussels, in his valedictory address to EU leaders, Cameron was acknowledging the role that immigration played in this EU campaign, saying that actually if they want Britain to continue trading in the single market, they're going to have to accept some form of curbs on migration because voters are furious about this. But one of Cameron's other great mistakes was actually to rely on Jeremy Corbyn to save his bacon. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is probably about as trustworthy around anyone's political bacon at the moment as a dog is. And Labour's political bacon will not be saved by him, let alone David Cameron's. And we saw his completely lacklustre performance in the EU referendum campaign, in which his team appeared to actually be sabotaging the Remain cause at times, or he just couldn't be bothered to put the effort in at all. And that leads us on to Labour's problems, which really are very serious indeed. We've obviously just seen a vote of no confidence passed in Jeremy Corbyn by 172 votes to 40 in the Parliamentary Labour Party. But he will unbelievably be leading Prime Minister's questions for the opposition today. And his MPs, after some debate, have decided that they're going to turn up because they're so embarrassed by their party. They feel they need to do the work of the opposition front bench because their front bench is so embarrassing, Jeremy Corbyn. But Labour MPs are miserable about their party, they're miserable about how their party looks. They're also incredibly miserable after this referendum because a lot of their constituencies voted out. And there was this look on their face which I found quite familiar during the campaign, and I was trying to work out when I'd last seen it, and I realised that I'd seen it on the faces of Scottish Labour MPs in the early months of 2015 when they'd survived the independence referendum but were suddenly realising that all their voters had disappeared and that their massive majorities in their Scottish seats were disappearing. And last night I caught the train home with two Labour MPs who both had pretty solid majorities. And I said, well, you'll be okay. And they said, no, you said that to our Scottish colleagues and look what happened to them. There's one of them left and he's just resigned from the shadow front bench. So we could see happening to Labour what happened to Labour in Scotland, in its northern heartlands in England, where MPs were coming back reporting with quite some horror a huge disconnect between their party and their natural voters, the voters they sort of thought belonged to them. Even outside of those northern heartlands, in seats where the MP has been a real fighter on immigration, Margaret Hodge in Barking and Dagenham, those MPs were coming back absolutely horrified by the extent of the anger and later the extent of the outvote in those seats. So the party is in a really, really difficult situation, and that actually has gone back before Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. This was a problem for Labour long before Corbyn was elected leader. It was something Miliband made some very half-hearted and half-baked attempts to address by sort of warbling on about his family not sitting under the same oak tree for 200 years. But the party has not heeded the warnings about his immigration problem, which again mirrors its problem in Scotland. For years and years, people within the party were warning that there was a nationalist threat in Scotland that it wasn't dealing with. It made half-baked attempts to address that, and now is not a political force in Scotland at all. So moving on to the Tories, the golden rule of politics at the moment, I'm going to try and cheer you up a little bit by saying that actually, no matter how bad things are for the Tories, they're always worse for Labour. So actually, we're moving on to the more cheerful party at the moment, even though the Prime Minister has just resigned and they're in the middle of a very bitter leadership contest in which everyone's getting very upset with one another, and we're only a few days in. Now, this is going to be a very, very tight timetable for the Tories. They've just moved it back by a week to the 9th of September for the confirmation of their leader, which I have a suspicion had quite a lot to do with the number of MPs and Tory members who had quite nice holidays booked and were a little bit grumpy about the idea of a whole summer full of hustings. But it's this very short timetable for the party to decide not just its new leader, not just its new Prime Minister, but the leader who is going to take Britain out of the European Union and reunite the party. This is not an easy job for anyone to take on. Our two front runners at the moment are obviously Boris Johnson and Theresa May, and I think it's become sort of received wisdom that Boris is going to find this contest very easy. He's the politician who gets stopped for selfies in the street. He's the Heineken politician who can touch parts that other politicians can't. But actually, all of those things are true. He is very good at campaigning for the Conservatives, very good obviously at campaigning for Leave as well. But that doesn't necessarily make him a good Prime Minister. He's still untested at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, which is very different to Mayor's Question Time in City Hall. And if anyone's watched Mayor's Question Time in City Hall, he's got away with quite a lot for quite a long time, and actually the Commons will be a bit of a shock for him. He's up against Theresa May, who, despite actually not having a great record on all the things that voters care about, such as border controls and cutting immigration, has managed to survive as the longest-serving Home Secretary for a very long time and can therefore run on her record as a serious government minister. And there's real anger in the Conservative Party, including from Brexiteers, about Boris's position. There's a suspicion that actually he took it for career reasons rather than out of actual sincerity. His article in The Telegraph on Monday really upset Conservatives because he started suggesting that actually immigration to this country wouldn't change that much. And there's been a bit of a ruction in his campaign since, and an agreement that his columns will be vetted before they go to The Telegraph, which will mean a significant change in his working practices given how late he tends to file his columns. Boris's challenge also is to articulate what sort of Leave model he actually wants, and this is the real challenge for the Leave camp in general, who've been sort of saying, oh, well, we didn't really want to talk about that, that's the job for the government. Well, actually, they may well be in government if Boris wins the Tory leadership, so they've got a very challenging summer ahead indeed. And as for what happens after the summer, well, in the past year and a bit, I thought that Labour was going to be in government after the general election, that Jeremy Corbyn running for Labour leader was quite sweet, and that Remain were going to win the referendum. So I'm not going to predict anything. Thank you.
Not even whether there's going to be an election in the autumn.
Well, Boris's team are sort of rowing back from that, partly because actually Tory MPs are absolutely knackered. I mean, they're really, really exhausted. Any new Tory MP will have won their seat in 2015, spent the summer moving their family to the constituency, setting up an office, trying to work out actually what on earth being an MP entails, campaigned in this referendum, and now they're thinking, another election? Come on. And they are worried that they could still lose their marginal seat, which I think probably is a huge and undeserved compliment to Labour at the moment, because I don't think they're winning anything at the moment. But I'm not sure about a snap election. The problem is that any new leader does need a mandate for the model of Brexit, and that's sort of a second election is in a sense an easier thing to do than a second referendum on the model. So,
I mean, the argument that was put to me the other day, which is first off, the Tories can capitalise on the absolute mess that Labour's in, and secondly, Gordon Brown was very much harmed by never having a mandate, and therefore that carried forward with him.
Yeah, which is a really compelling case for a second election. I think capitalising on the mess that Labour's in, if you do it in the next few months, great. But I mean, politics is so unpredictable at the moment, they could elect someone who's all right. I mean, I doubt they will, and I wouldn't put money on it, but you never know.
Well, I think we're struggling to find that person. Right, I'd like to open this out for questions. I'm sure everybody's got a lot of questions. I'm not entirely sure we have a lot of answers, but please, if you could give me your name when you ask a question? Gentleman at the back there.
I'm Robin Savage. I'm from Zeus Capital. I probably should say also my wife happens to be an MP, but anyway, that's a sort of separate point. But the Dalai Lama, anyway, well, she's Lucy Allen from Telford, but the Conservative MP. And Telford, for anyone who likes to know, is in Shropshire. The Dalai Lama says when you lose something, don't lose the message. And I think the people who lost the referendum should really have a heartfelt look at what it is, or why they are so upset about the end response. And if you look at the geographic map of where the votes came in, what you'll see is London, Oxford, Liverpool, interestingly, because they don't like Boris, and Scotland, voted Remain, and the rest of the country pretty much voted Leave. And I think if people actually went out, I was told that the FT sent their foreign correspondent out to go and to the Midlands to go and see what people actually were saying outside of London, and they discovered what anyone who actually was out there knocking on doors and listening to people, that for the last 2 or 3 years, as I've been doing, it is absolutely clear. And if you listen to the people outside of London, they were going to vote for Leave. So I think one of the key things, well, the question is, what lesson do you think the Remainers ought to be taking from the election?
Before we go to the political question, can I just ask George the economic question? Because are we essentially two nations? And we've got very strong southeast and certain metropolitan areas, and then a disadvantaged north, Midlands, bits of the south, particularly west.
Well, I have a unique insight because not only I live in London, work in London, but my whole family is up in the northwest, and I have parents who are elderly who are northwestern based, so they are the ideal, perfect demographic for voting out, which they did. When I asked them why they voted out, I mean, I've tested this with a few people to ask why people thought they voted out. My perception is that it's largely due to sovereignty, which also obviously incorporates immigration. And a lot of people say to me, it's not sovereignty because people don't understand what sovereignty actually means. Well, they might not understand what sovereignty means, but they can put it in a different terminology. And certainly my parents and my family decided to vote out for that reason. They just said that they were fed up with being told what to do by a group of unelected people in Brussels. Now, whether that's accurate or not is up for debate, but that's how people, certainly in my family, felt. And I suspect I've heard that so many times that I think it probably is a reasonable assumption that people are upset about the fact that they don't feel that their voice is being heard in Europe.
And just on that, I mean, David, you pointed out that a lot of people in the city were angry, but not necessarily with themselves. Is there an arrogance?
Yes, I mean some leaders in the city who have been, particularly in the sort of the government of the city, corporation, who've been most worried about the backlash against the city since the financial crisis, have been arguing that we've got to do much better than this, or we're going to pay the price. And now say we are partly reaping what we sowed here. This is a reaction against the elite, and the city is right at the top of that tree, and certainly some people are saying, "Well, I told you so." I mean, whether realistically, whatever the city had done, would have made any difference is another question.
So, Isabel, how do the politicians connect with the mass outside the M25?
Well, I think the approach of a lot of Labour politicians has been to tell voters what is good for them and not listen to those voters. It doesn't necessarily mean that listening to voters doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sort of be blown about like a sheet in the wind by what they think. But I think there's a problem with political parties, and particularly a problem for Labour, which actually some of its losing candidates wrote quite compellingly about recently, which is that its activists and some of its MPs will turn up on doorsteps and the voter will open the door in their pyjamas or something like that, and the politician will jump in and say, this is why you should vote for us and this is why we're right. And actually the voter's quite angry about something but never gets a chance to say it. And if they do get a chance to say it, they get slapped down. And one of Labour's losing candidates described the party's activists as being, I think she said, like middle-class passengers going on Ryanair, in that they sort of look down on voters. And I think that's a real problem, that actually there's a sort of metropolitan core in parties who, you know, live in London, who think immigration's absolutely fine, and who cannot understand why someone would take a different view, and have probably got into the sort of Facebook mindset where you kind of broadcast your views in quite a kind of vehement fashion and get very upset when someone takes an opposing view, rather than wondering whether actually that there's a reason socially and geographically that they take that stance. I think also your point about message. Now, the Vote Leave campaign had a really strong message, and I mean, it was really annoying. They just kept talking about taking back control, but actually people remembered it. And it was the same as the Conservatives in the general election with their long-term economic plan. When lobby journalists start cringing at hearing a phrase 8 times in one broadcast, that's when it's starting to cut through to the general public. And the Remain side didn't have that. They just didn't have it. I mean, they talked about being better off and stronger in Europe, but it never cut through in the same way. Never cut through.
And I think people in the city completely. I mean, if the Remain camp's mistake was to focus solely on the economy and Project Fear, that was even more so in the city, where really the idea that something abstract like control and sovereignty could trump what they saw as the obvious short-term economic interests of voters, they just found it completely inconceivable.
No, I completely agree. I do identify with the middle class person on Ryanair, having taken Ryanair for work, and that is you being the only person in a suit and all the rest in shell suits. That's next question, Mr. Schofield.
Ian Schofield, City of London Corporation. Obviously, freedom of movement of labour is very important to the city. Do you think it's possible to do something like a freedom of movement of labour, where people have to have a job in order to come to London to maintain access to the single market, because obviously the two go hand in hand, for the EU? Also, what are your thoughts on something like a London visa, where people can freedom of movement to London specifically?
David, London visa, but just point out that he's dual nationality, so we can't get rid of him.
I mean, there are lots of people in the city who are talking about such ideas, but I have no good feeling for whether they could possibly fly.
Can I just broaden this question, because immigration is the biggest issue that seems to have come out of this. We talk about the take back control, but it was immigration that really won it, as it were, and nobody seems to have actual answer. Lots of people have questions, but nobody has an answer. And do we think that there's anything that the UK can do to give people who are worried about immigration reassurance without cutting off our own, being seen as some sort of Little Englander, Little Britainer pariah, and B, stopping the talent that feeds Britain coming in?
I think we'd have a far greater acceptance of immigration if voters believed it was the UK government which was actually making the decisions on immigration. Even if it was exactly the same number of people who came in under the EU, it's just a case of we have a choice. Every 5 years we can then elect that government on our choice of how much immigration we want. The point is that people will feel that they have a choice over that number. When you have, I think in 2015, there were 170,000 Romanian migrants who came to the UK over the course of 2015. It was the most, certainly the 170,000 people who applied for national insurance numbers wanting to work in the UK. So to address your question about the issue of people working here, a lot of migrants are not coming here to take benefits, not coming here to do nothing. They're coming here to work. And I'm not sure that will make a vast amount of difference if we did restrict it to only people who work, because most people are coming here to work. They're looking for a better life. And so the fact that you can't control migration when you are in the EU, and that statement from Mrs. Merkel last night proves this beyond doubt. You have a choice. You can either be in the single market or you can choose your migration policy. But there doesn't seem to be a vast amount in between, and that's the real problem. It makes it exceptionally difficult to choose something like the European Economic Area. What is the point of voting out of the European Union to go into the European Economic Area, which has all of the same problems that people were voting against in the election or in the referendum, and yet just takes the seat away from the table? It is by far the worst possible outcome.
What I don't understand is that, Isabel, you may be able to help, is why the government did not make a concerted effort to say, right, in areas where there's high levels of immigration, we will have a scheme to ensure that there is more investment in the public services that might come under strain, and which is for most, and indeed on some sort of something they could say about employment. I mean, obviously that doesn't address the control issue, but talking to people whose and I talked to a lot of ordinary people or people in low-paid jobs in London about why they were voting Leave, and it was the people I talked to, it wasn't a control issue. It was, look, these bright young Europeans are taking my jobs, and I can't get into school because I can't get my kids into school, and the pressure on A&E queues and all that. And that was what they were concerned about. Why the government couldn't do more to say, right, we recognise there can be pressures, this is what we're going to do about it.
Well, they did. They scrapped a migration impact fund that Labour had brought in. It was such an insignificant pot of money that actually wouldn't have made very much difference anyway. But they're now talking about pretty much that now. But I mean, it's such a small pot of money that you just need more money to be able to make any kind of sense of an impact. But that is a really important part of it, is the public services, because it's when people feel the material impacts of immigration that they start to get very upset naturally, because if they can't find a school place for their child, for instance, then they get very worked up. I think everyone does. And I know there was a conversation in Labour about how they were tackling immigration, and lots of MPs were saying, well, actually, this is what our constituents are worried about. It's not about how their communities are changing culturally. It's just actually the local school and the local hospital, and what can we do about that? And they were sort of slapped down by their front bench who were saying, no, we had a migration impact fund, and they were saying, well, it's a bit of a bigger issue than that. But I think your point, George, about the sort of taking back control and the government feeling in control or giving the impression of being in control of those decisions is really important. And I think sort of politically, politicians tend to make tactical interventions on immigration, partly because they're I can't believe I'm about to use this phrase, they're part of the metropolitan elite who actually are quite comfortable with immigration themselves, and often it looks quite insincere when they give these speeches saying, oh, we realise that you voters are very upset by this, so we're going to do something sort of ineffectual that looks quite tactical that you're not going to believe in, and then we're going to forget about it until you get annoyed again about this in another European election in a few years' time. So I think that there needs to be a sense that this is really urgent, and this is something that people feel, rather than actually, oh, we've got to tick the immigration box on the grid and then move on to something we actually like talking about.
I mean, I live in Islington North. I admit I have voted for Jeremy Corbyn. I'll come out, not in the leadership election. And it is by far the most diverse place you could live in. My kids' schools, they have Albanians, Germans, people from the Indian subcontinent, people from China, everything there, and they're mixing together absolutely wonderfully. But I don't think that that people in the Westminster bubble can understand what people are thinking of, because they think that they are somehow racist, and I think that's the problem. Question here: do we think that Farage can actually capitalise on this and actually produce a credible competitor to Labour?
Well, this is what's absolutely fascinating is Farage is in a better position than the SNP were after the Scottish independence referendum. All of these Labour seats have voted out where UKIP were already in second place to Labour. But he is not, in terms of party organisation, in the same place as the SNP at all. They have always, well, for many years now, been a very slick, on-message machine who've got one sense of mission and they know how to deliver it. Actually, UKIP has always had one sense of mission until recently, when actually I think the sense of mission has been sort of keep Farage in power eternally, and some of his interventions during the campaign were hugely unhelpful and almost a sort of attention-seeking act of sabotage, particularly when he managed to concede for Remain in the early hours after the polls had closed. And he's not really speaking to any of his UKIP colleagues. He called Douglas Carswell, the party's one MP, irrelevant during the referendum campaign, which bodes well. And so really, UKIP could squander its greatest opportunity, or what it could do is take votes from people who actually don't really notice what's going on in politics but are angry, and therefore let the Tories into some of these seats. And it could be more of a force in the northeast, whereas the Tories could be quite strong in the northwest, where they're already chasing down Labour MPs in a number of seats. The northeast is just more difficult for them politically, but because of Thatcher, basically. But actually, it's in the best and worst position at the moment, so it's going to be fascinating to see. And I think that there are further rows to come in UKIP based on what people in the party have been telling me. So, yeah.
Next question, gentleman over there.
I was wondering what you thought of investment in this country, so decisions that seem to be independent of Brexit, like infrastructure investment, things like Heathrow, Point, HS2. You've got two sides of the argument now that are saying either no, this puts a line under them, we can't do them, or now we need them more than ever. Which side do you fall on?
Yeah, I've seen both sides of those arguments. I mean, I guess in the event that we see the economy weakening sufficiently, you might well need those investments to support the economy. Government spending is a part of the expenditure breakdown of the national accounts as part of GDP. Obviously, if we spend more, it will create employment. It'll create consumer spending. It'll be helpful for the private sector. So in that sense, it's good. But the question then is, can we afford it? The numbers I've run have said, why don't we imagine you kept the austerity plan exactly as it is, and then work through my weaker GDP forecast to work out what sort of deficit that you would have in 3 years' time. The Chancellor currently expects that the deficit will be 0 in 3 years' time. If you work through my numbers, it looks more like it will be still 3% in 3 years' time. And that is without any change in the austerity plan. If you then ditch that and start spending a lot more, potentially, you could easily see a situation where the deficit goes up 4 or 5% relative to the 0, which we would have expected in 3 years' time. Now, given that the Chancellor spent the last 6 years desperately trying to bring this down and get it to 0, I think that would be quite a disappointing outcome. So I think it is a challenging situation, and it really depends upon how weak the economy gets on the back of this.
Just to pull that on, and how significant is the Wimbledon effect that, I think it was Gordon Brown coined it, or Blair coined it, that you don't actually have to own the competition to have the best players to own the competition, and therefore it's okay for all of our public services to be delivered by French or Italian or Spanish or American companies. And now a lot of them are really pissed off with the UK and probably looking for other places to invest.
Yes, I mean, I certainly talked to a large EU bank yesterday who said they thought that some of their country's biggest companies, who are big investors in the UK, would be thinking about certainly future investment, let alone if not their current investment. Just going back to the infrastructure point, the thing about big infrastructure projects is that the impact on the economy is way down the track, isn't it? And this is going to be the economy is going to be weak very soon, and building a Heathrow or something doesn't have any impact on the economy for years and years, does it? and also as we've seen in good times, the amount of sort of political bandwidth that is required to get these things done is enormous, and there just isn't going to be that bandwidth around now. I mean, the whole machine is going to be devoted to something else. So I would, however much you think that would be the obvious thing to do, I think in practice it might.
I mean, I would say that investment has two effects. It has an effect immediately on GDP because every pound spent is a pound of government spending spent. And of course, when you get interest rates at these sort of levels, it might make sense to borrow in the long run to do those. It's certainly what Keynes would have said, for example. The other issue, of course, is that sterling being pushed so far down might actually act as an impetus for overseas investment. I saw a joke this week saying that the only thing that's supporting sterling this week is Roy Hodgson. But the sterling, if it falls further, I mean, I saw a story yesterday in the paper which was talking about investors thinking about buying houses, overseas investors buying more houses in London, never mind less because of the Brexit, simply because of the fall in the currency. So it may well support inward investment, or at least, should I say, limit the decline in inward investment, which we would have seen otherwise, the fall in sterling.
But in a time of political instability, it's not a great time for the Tories to be pushing through a great big train line through most of their safest seats.
No, and the National Audit Office's report hasn't really helped that either. When you talk about the Wimbledon effect, I live just down the road from the All England Club, so all I can think of at the moment is total gridlock, chaos and confusion. But on infrastructure, if the Tories elect Boris as leader, that's curtains for Heathrow expansion, and we're back to probably another instance of politicians not taking back control, farming something out to a quango because they're too lily-livered to make a decision themselves. Hopefully it'll take a few years before they have to do anything. And then faffing about when that independent body makes a decision because it's not a decision that they want to take, which is quite dispiriting. But to be honest, that might have happened even if there hadn't been Brexit, because that's what politicians are like.
Time for one more question. Have we? Gentleman at the back.
Yes, I have very little comment on the largest single employer in the UK, which is essentially small businesses. That we have a reputation for being creative and innovative, and my experience of trying to help companies set up smaller businesses in Europe is that if you want to be innovative on the mainland, and I preface this with very much wanting to stay in, but it is in comparison to setting up small businesses and SMEs in the UK, I mean, it's a complete nightmare. And isn't there an advantage that can be driven from the fact that we are now free of any further interference? You know, we are where we are. Isn't there a possibility that small businesses could actually do extremely well, and we remain very attractive for entrepreneurs because we have a cheaper cost base with sterling, and because we have a history of being more entrepreneurial than the continent, and that we can do more to assist that? And that could be quite short-term changes. What is your view?
Well, certainly talking to sort of small fintech companies, they who are in general very worried about leave because of freedom of movement, because I mean one of the driving forces behind London's rise in the fintech world is the fact that everybody in Europe can come here easily, and they come here partly because it's so much easier to set up businesses. And they, I mean, this is not a representative sample, but they think that the ease of setting up businesses, funding them, is such a strength of the UK that that will continue to thrive, and indeed, if the government must grasp this, the next government must grasp this opportunity and highlight this this strength, and big it up and support it in any way it can. So I think you're right that strength remains and is very, very significant in areas like that.
George, are small businesses going to ride to the rescue of the UK economy?
I think you could argue this on both sides. I mean, first of all, yes, you would potentially have a reduction in the amount of red tape that has to be gone through from Brussels if we weren't in the EU. On the other hand, of course, the fact that we have two then types of regulation, British regulation, which will divert from European regulation, makes you just have more lots of it if you're an exporter. And then when it comes to the export side, if you are an exporter, on the one hand, you've got a lower currency, which is helpful for exports, but it might take some time for that to come through. On the other hand, you've got lower sterling, which is going to increase the cost of the goods that you use in your input process. I mean, that's probably true not just for small businesses, but for all businesses. And I think
we're
those are
largely a
two.
service economy, so therefore that wouldn't come into play.
But that probably also means that you use more labour. And if we are going to restrict inward migration, it might also push the price of existing labour, whether you use inward migrants or not. It will push potentially the price of wage or the wages up, which is another possibility.
Like Boris, I'm going to go back on something I said before. We've got time for one more question. If there is anybody who'd like to ask anything.
Hi. You mentioned earlier about the EEA, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what's the most viable plan going forward. I mean, we obviously don't want a full Brexit where we're sort of trading on WTO rules, but I mean, what you said EEA will be a nightmare. I mean, but what about EFTA? What about some other model? Which what would you think we should do going forward for negotiating the EU?
I guess the good thing is that we do know the extent of the most interactive and the least interactive we can be. So we know it's got to be between these options. The most interactive is the European Economic Area, which is what Norway is in. It means it has to accept all of the rules of the EU, about 75% of EU rules, which it has to accept. And it has no say in those, but it does remain pretty much a full member of the single market. So that would be the least disruptive economically, we know that. On the other end of the spectrum is the WTO, which means you leave essentially without a deal. And that would be probably the most economically disruptive. While tariffs have gone down, the external tariff of the European Union has gone down over the past 20 years, it's still exceptionally high for some goods and services. In particular, cars and car parts attract an almost 10% tariff when we export to the EU. Dairy products attracts a 36% tariff when we export to the EU. I think wine, not that we export a vast amount of wine to the EU, is about 33%. So some of these tariffs, yes, they've gone down, but they're still very high. I imagine that it will probably have to be something in between all of that. I think EEA membership is very difficult to justify when people voted out because of sovereignty and immigration, especially when that's exactly what we will not be able to have control over if we remain in the EEA. But equivalently, I think WTO option so in other words, relying on these external tariffs of the EU is probably a bit too draconian. So I suspect we're going to have some sort of trade deal which respects the wishes of the British people, that they want some control over both their own sovereignty and particularly over immigration.
David, choose your acronym. Which one do you want to go for?
Well, I'd agree with George, and that I think the cities hope that they can get EEA and a lot of them kind of, and that's what they're pushing for, complete retaining passporting in its entirety, and I just think that's politically impossible.
Isabel, so we've got PM Boris trying to sell a deal which essentially is just the same deal that we had with the EU except under a different name. How does that work?
Quite like there's a Labour MP called Johnny Reynolds who tweeted, breaking, Boris wants us to join the EU, when he wrote his column earlier this week. I think there's a real problem for the Leave side, which is that none of them really agreed on the model during the campaign, but they kept quiet about it, partly because it was convenient that they'd not get scrutinised on that model, but also if one of them started talking about their preferred model, everyone else would get very upset. But now they do need to start talking about it. And that's the real challenge for Boris, and actually also for Theresa May as well, because she campaigned nominally for Remain, even though she sort of went and hid in a cupboard for most of the campaign. She needs to set out what she's going to do to obey the will of the British people, and that's a real challenge for her as well.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers. They've been very illuminating, if not particularly encouraging, dare I say. But this has been a fascinating debate. I still think we've got more questions and answers, but I think we've had some of the answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you.